Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast.
Welcome back, Adapters. I hope everyone is doing well. Okay, so first off, this episode has two parts in case you get a bit confused. So kicking us off, I have another episode of Australia Adapts with Dr. Johanna Nalau. Johanna interviews sustainable tourism expert Dr. Susanne Becken from Griffith University in Queensland, Australia. Okay, and so for the second part of this episode, I have a wrap-up of my daily dispatches from the National Adaptation Forum that I just got back from last week. So if you recall last week's episode of the podcast, I was doing these micro podcasts from St. Paul, and this was at the forum. My final micro podcasts are in this episode. There are 3 of them, and I just wanted to include them. There were some great conversations, and so we have Australia Adapts, and then we just have these final dispatches from the National Adaptation Forum. So if it's a little confusing on how these two things were meshed together, that's why I'm explaining it now. Okay, so I have been doing a bit of traveling the past month. First off, I was doing on-location podcast at Harvard University where I was interviewing students from the Graduate School of Design where they are doing some adaptation work in East Boston. I will go into more detail in future episodes, and I'm not quite sure when I'm going to release that episode. It's going to take a while. I had over 25 interviews. It was just a fascinating experience, and Harvard is doing some great work, but I just want to throw that out there. And also, when I was in St. Paul, Minnesota at the National Adaptation Forum, this was last week, which means nothing to you if you're listening to this at some point in the future, but May 13th through May 15th, and I was there. It was a fantastic event. As you can imagine, the Adaptation Forum is very relevant to what I'm trying to do with this podcast. I recognized a lot of people there, just a lot of old colleagues and such, and it was a great chance to start sharing what I'm doing with the podcast. And so what was really cool for me is that I would occasionally run into a random person, and there was about 1,000 people at this event who would come up and they say, "Hey, America Adapts, I love that podcast." And so I have to say that people are hearing about it in that whole network. And I actually arranged to meet up with some regular listeners too. You know who you are. It was such a thrill to meet some of you in person that they were listeners, and we knew we were both going to this event, and I got to meet people in person and put a face to folks, and that was really cool. So a big event. I had a poster there. I was sharing a little table space and just getting the word out. I think people were kind of going up to the poster and thinking, what the heck is this? There's a lot of wonky tables and such. And here was this poster of a lot of my guests and sort of this kind of Hollywood style poster. And so it was good. Just a good chance to kind of get the word out of what the podcast is all about and very relevant to the people attending. So if you want to learn more about that forum, they have a website. Just search for National Adaptation Forum and a lot of the presentations and such. Okay, as part of that forum, I actually went to a members meeting of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, or ASAP, in St. Paul. So remember, ASAP and America Adapts have created this partnership where we're, sort of promoting each other. And so here's the plug. If you are interested in connecting with a network of adaptation professionals from across North America, check out adaptationprofessionals.org. This link is also included in my show notes, and Beth Gibbons is their managing director, and she was there, and we had some great conversations, and she'll be sharing America Adapts on various platforms over at ASAP, newsletters and on the websites. And so we're just kind of promoting each other because I obviously support what they're trying to do, create some cohesiveness to this emerging issue of adaptation, and they recognize that the podcast and the sort of people that I get on is very relevant to their members. All right, so quickly, some future travel. I'm headed to Uganda for the Community-Based Adaptation Conference, and it's going to be in Kampala, Uganda in late June. I'm getting sponsored to go over there and interview some folks. I'm very excited about this because I actually don't have much international adaptation experience, and it's going to be a chance for me to learn a lot. Think much different issues in developing countries when it comes to climate change. And I hope some of those stories will inform some of the stories that I bring, back to, there's certainly an emphasis on North America in my podcast. So going to Uganda, very excited. First time I've been to Africa. And so folks out there who deal with developing country and adaptation issues, if you have articles or papers that you think might be useful to me, I'd like to do a lot of homework before I get somewhere so I can ask hopefully useful questions. And so send them to me at americaadapts@gmail.com. Or if you know anyone who's going to the CBA 11, also let me know. Maybe I can go do a micro podcast with them. Okay, don't forget I love hearing from all you guys at americaadapts@gmail.com. It's the best part of my week when I get that random email. If you have ideas for guests or feedback, I love to hear from you. People write me these sometimes long letters on, what they're getting out of the podcast. And I love that. It's very important to me, and I really appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to do more housekeeping at the end of this episode, but next week it'll kind of be more of a traditional episode, and I have Dr. Ben Preston from RAND Corporation coming on. We have a nice substantive conversation about what RAND's doing on adaptation. All right, so let's jump right into another episode of America Adapts. Okay, wait, not so fast. I just want to provide a little context. I was having some conversations at the National Adaptation Forum about the podcast and this new segment we have with Australia Adapts. And so I wanted to just briefly talk about that because this is the second episode of Australia Adapts, and people weren't quite clear on how it's part of America Adapts. And just a little bit of history. I met Johanna just online. She had found the podcast, and so she contacted me, and we just started talking. And then we thought it'd be a great idea for her to start interviewing some folks in Australia about what they're doing over there. And I just kind of use the umbrella of America Adapts to share those stories. And so today she's talking with Dr. Susanne Becken, who's also based in Australia. But here's this thing. Dr. Becken is actually German, and Johanna is from Finland, and they're both living in Australia doing adaptation issues there. And so it's just this real international presence to the podcast, and I love that. This podcast is going global. Okay, so we will keep publishing these segments in the future. They'll be semi-recurring. Usually they're about 20-minute conversations, and we'll attach them to a normal episode. And I just want to give some context if people are kind of like, what's this Australia Adapts? Because there's only been one episode before, and so that's what we're doing again here. All right, so let's jump right in. Now to Johanna.
Hi, this is Dr. Johanna Nalau, and welcome to the second episode of Australia Adapts. In this episode, I speak with Professor Susanne Becken, who's the director for Griffith Institute for Tourism. And Susanne has very long-term career, or has had a very long-term career in looking at how the tourism sector is mitigating, so what options they have to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, but also how some of the global trends regarding peak oil and the price changes might impact travel, and also looking at adaptation. So how does the sector actually start to consider some of the impacts that are coming in the future, and how they deal with extreme events, which obviously have a big impact on the tourism industry. And some of her we also discussed some of her recent research in the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, which is a hot topic at the moment with all the bleaching and what might that mean for Australian tourism industry. And I think it's a very interesting example globally as well for those international listeners on what can the sector do if one of the main attractions, for instance, an coral reef ecosystem starts declining. And we also discussed the global sustainability tourism dashboard that Susanna is involved in, and that links again with Paris Agreement and how so they have been developing some indicators how to measure the sustainability in the sector using big data globally. So that's another fascinating initiative that we'll talk about that's global, and lots of examples also from Australia. So I hope you enjoy the episode. Thanks. In this episode, I'll talk with Professor Susanne Becken from Griffith Institute for Tourism and her adaptation journey. Susanna, so I just wanted to ask a few questions. First, as people keep saying, adaptation is such a new discipline, but you've been doing adaptation research quite a long time. So I read your first 2005 paper on adaptation mitigation in the tourism sector in Fiji. Mm-hmm. So could you just tell us a little bit how you got interested in adaptation, what your background is as well?
No, that's interesting actually that you mentioned that paper. This is now 12 years ago. I actually did come more from the mitigation side in that particular Fiji project as well, because my PhD was on energy use in tourism, and I looked at greenhouse gas emissions. And when I had the opportunity to work in Fiji at the resorts, which is really interesting also from an energy point of view and emissions, but it is obvious when you start talking to them that it's really also an adaptation problem, because most of them, if not all, basically are located right at the coast, often too close. And then you learn about, obviously there's legislation that they have to be X meters away from the high tide mark, which often they are not. And you learn about water issues in Fiji. You've got sort of droughts mixing with floods. So what do they do about it? How do they prepare? Extreme events, of course, in Fiji, like in the other islands, big thing. So, mitigation and fuel consumption is one thing, but really for the existence of the resource is probably the adaptation that is more important for survival. So then the paper actually was harmonizing mitigation, adaptation, because you can't really separate. Because, for example, it turned out that some things that one might approach as mitigation in the first instance are, so you are self-sufficient or you have a renewable energy plant of whatever kind, you've got a solar panel. Actually, they're really good because if there's a storm and you're cut off from your supply line, you are more resilient, and in some ways that has been then an adaptation to those increased extreme events. So same with water efficiency. So you think about water as maybe a mitigation action in the sense that pumping water and so on, the less the better. But of course, saving water is a major adaptation measure for drought. Yeah. So you can't really separate them often.
So you were in New Zealand when you were doing the research, or at the...
Yeah, I was in New Zealand. So I still was probably mainly working on sort of carbon emissions from aviation and so on. And so the Fiji was really an interesting first sort of move into adaptation. And then a little bit later, you can't separate from the extreme events. And I got more interested in resilience more broadly. And that, of course, relates so closely to climate change adaptation. Yeah. Especially when, Fiji, but also basically most tourism businesses who don't think long term at all. Like they think about the next season. Yeah. So you then try to talk about adaptation. It doesn't mean so much. You talk about resilience in extreme weather events. That's, makes all sense. And so we had a big government funded project in New Zealand on climate change, which we essentially in the first year turned almost more into a climate variability project. Because when we started talking to the tourism operators and the eyes glaze over, and you talk about, you bring out your scenarios for 2050 and 2070, which we created with NEVA. And they say, okay, that's all interesting, but not so relevant. You talk about next year or you talk about tomorrow and there's an extreme weather warning or the glacier, the snow fluctuations for the ski fields. That's all really interesting. So we had to reframe the whole thing. Yeah. And got quite good interest in.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what about the research that you've been doing in Australia? So I understand you've been working a lot in the Great Barrier Reef. So what are the kind of challenges that you see specifically in Australia to tourism and in the context of climate change and adaptation?
Australia is a really interesting one because I think, a lot of things that one might class adaptation, in some ways autonomous adaptation, people are doing. People are in the businesses are reasonably good in water efficiency, for example. And so when we analyzed a big data set on water use in hotels, it turned out that Australia was amongst the most efficient in the world. Now, you ask any hotel or resort whether they adapt to climate change, and so they probably wouldn't know. But it's inherent because of the geographic context and the experience of droughts. If you ask specifically about adaptation, it's actually in Australia not the tourism industry is not particularly forward planning in that sense. However, in some places like the Great Barrier Reef in particular, the operators are very aware. And so there have been plans and strategies, what to do, but it's quite limited. Yeah. So the tourism industry there has probably been more lobbying other sectors to help reduce the pressure and increase the resilience of the reef as such. So whether that now counts as adaptation to maybe create the policy pressure for general action to reduce impacts, I'm not sure. That's sort of an indirect, but probably the only way you can adapt to things like coral bleaching and some of those changes we see. Well, you could also, in some ways, less responsive actions like they change the diving sites in response. So you apply for a concession and say, okay, that site is not good anymore. We need to rotate. So
and has that been happening?
Oh, that's happening all the time. Yeah, they're quite on board and trying to pick the best places and the best seasons and also maybe enhancing products. So if you have a reef operation and you might buy into a land-based ecotourism operation and diversify your portfolio. So these things are happening. And especially now, I know because we spoke with the CEO of the Australian Marine Tour Operator Association a few weeks ago, and because they're very concerned, the second bleaching event in a row. Yeah. And now, regardless how bad, but the publicity and the social media presence of that means that some people basically won't book. Yeah. So that's this whole idea of last chance tourism gone wrong.
Yeah, no, I've heard that, and I've actually seen it somewhere that I've actually had people tell me that, they are planning to go to the Great Barrier Reef before it's too late.
Yeah. See, and that's really sad. That's why I don't like this last chance tourism. But, I spoke to, one of the managers at Tourism Events Queensland. So that's the Queensland marketing body for tourism who try to get people here, of course. And he said he would like to turn it around and say, rather than last chance to see it, last chance to do something about it. So come here and help. Yeah. Come here and volunteer. There's, for example, citizen science projects where people can help with information, or just come and spend money, so that, because one of the key arguments in the recent years was that tourism, of course, brings money to the economy because of the reef. It's the single largest attractor in Australia, really. If we lose that, it's a big problem, and that gets politicians interested.
Yeah. Yeah, because, it is, and for those in the US don't necessarily know, we just had Cyclone Debbie to come through, mostly in Queensland, the eastern coast of Australia, and I think the damage bill is extensive, and it has affected the tourism industry as well.
It does, and in fact, I just had a meeting. We've got two projects that involve big data analysis on what people say about the reef. And just today, I was told, because we're starting to analyze the Weibo data, so that's the Chinese social network like Twitter.
Okay, yeah.
And so on Cyclone Debbie, there were 1,100 conversations already from people in China who talk about Debbie. So we're doing sentiment analysis, and I assume it's not all good.
Yeah.
And people then, especially if they are more security conscious, then they might not come, and then they might also think the reef is destroyed. So that publicity is not good.
Yeah, because I think, and I suppose that's the kind of linkage, the extreme events and these kind of, if there is more bleaching or more cyclones, that's just obviously not just Australia, but it will have a big impact. So do you think the kind of trying to get more diverse activities is the answer, or?
Well, frankly, exactly. And that is something where I think some investment needs to be made to even think about the alternative Queensland without the reef. If you look at the climate models, it's actually not very pretty. It's not if, but when the reef will decline. And then the question is, how do you define decline? There will be always something, but what level of biodiversity and marine life do you need to support those, if you want ecosystem services of, protection of the shoreline, fish breeding grounds, recreational value, tourism value. So that is something I think that really requires some research. Yeah. In the moment, of course, we put a lot of effort into the land-based processes in terms of runoff and so on. But to actually think, if in 20, 30 years, there's not much left, the Queensland industry without tourism would be a completely different one. Yes. So I think it's worth thinking about now. And then, as you say, invest differently, or maybe identify those spots, the triage approach, those spots where maybe there is good diving still. So what do we think where that is, and what kind, and how can we market that and save that? And so I think a little bit of thought needs to go into that.
And do you think that, is there, with the decision makers that you've talked to, is there concern on are they kind of thinking about strategies that they could start putting in place? Or is it more, let's have a look at what happens next season or in the next 5 years? Or
yeah, that's a really interesting question, because there's huge concern. But has the thinking moved long-term for long-term strategy making? I don't think so. Some people are. If you look at the Queensland tourism strategy, that wouldn't be reflected at all. That's a pure growth strategy, assuming, the assets, the national assets being their business as usual, and just focusing on infrastructure development, air links. So it's a pure growth. So that hasn't infiltrated that. If you talk to individuals out there in the industry, they're very concerned. So yeah, let's watch that space. Hopefully research can inform it and maybe sort of or put some meat on the bone of those concerns. Because concern is one thing, but if you, and we have talked about the idea of maybe some innovative ways of visualizing or illustrating the change to people that might give that imagination or wake up call to say, okay, if that's what it looks like, we really need to invest, do something. So I think that would be a good avenue.
And I was thinking if you could say something about the reason, because I know that you work globally with many of your colleagues as well, looking at different sustainability issues.
Yes.
I thought maybe if you could just give a short kind of explanation what the tourism dashboard for sustainability is, and especially how you actually came up with the idea and how you developed that.
Yeah, so I try and give the 1 minute summary of how that happened, but so there's obviously the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and so 17 of them, and global bodies like the United Nations World Tourism Organization, like many others, say tourism contributes majorly. Of course, one might argue that's true to poverty alleviation, and there's a lot of examples. For example, Serengeti, where tourism contributes to biodiversity conservation. So there's a lot of discussion on how tourism can benefit. Now, no one has ever measured that. So we don't know, because you can also find in the literature a lot of examples how tourism exacerbates poverty. Or increases inequality and leads to conflict. So the truth is actually we don't know, and it probably always depends on the context. But we said, well, just like we measure international arrivals and expenditure. So, for example, there's 1.2 billion international movements, so international travel. There's about 4 billion domestic in China. And and there's about 3 billion in America. There's lots of travel. It's amazing. And no one measures. So these numbers are measured because they have economic interest.
Yes.
So it's money. But do we actually know how many, what's the amount of emissions created? And what is the gender equity in tourism globally? So we went about and created, based on the Sustainable Development Goals and with input from stakeholders, we came up with indicators that we can measure globally and track over time how tourism does actually contribute or not. And so what it does, there's a website, it's tourismdashboard.org. What it actually does is it demystifies some of the issues, like, for example, poverty alleviation. We look at how much of the global expenditure ends up in the least developed countries, the LDCs, and small island developing states, and it's less than 6%. So all tourism, most ends up basically in Europe and in North America. 6% in those countries now. It's growing, but whether you then can say tourism leads to poverty alleviation, it's probably smaller than most people think. And then it, of course, depends where do those 6% even go? And what do they do? So the dashboard is very high level. We've got a few climate change relevant indicators in there, like global aviation emissions. Obviously a key issue for tourism, sustainability. And the one issue where people might even say it's just an oxymoron. Sustainable tourism doesn't exist as long as people fly in planes. So we measure the emissions globally, and of course they are increasing at about 2 or 3% a year. And we also look at resource use in hotels, and we look at protected area tourism planning and so on. So it gives a good tool to monitor. Now, what we haven't got yet, but what we're hoping to do is the insurance claims made by tourism companies. Because what we want to capture, and we know that those data exist. The key is for those global data to get them. And so get partners like insurance companies who are willing to share. So we got that for aviation, for example, but for insurance, we're still working on it. The hypothesis being that if tourism businesses adapt, there should actually be less claims, or at least one would then obviously have to check the number of events and so on, but you would have a tracking mechanism to see if tourism as such is getting more and more affected by disasters or not. So we're working on that, on an adaptation one. In the meantime, we have to use others like the water efficiency, for example, which gives at least some indication on sustainability.
Because I think, in the, and what's probably of interest is the kind of, the discussions at quite high level at the moment is that there's supposed to be more integration with the Paris Agreement and those kind of processes and the SDGs with the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think something like the dashboard will be quite of interest to, both of these, but also, because in the Paris Agreement, they say about the Global Adaptation Goal. And so there's a lot of flurry of thinking at the moment. What's
how
that
do you measure,
like?
and
How do you measure that?
And that's always been the problem of adaptation. And so maybe things like the dashboard, even though they don't quite solve that question, but they are an example. And there's it's actually a trend, I think, now, the measure to manage approach. You can see a few of those initiatives where there's a Global Peace Institute that measure and visualize on a website safety and security, and there's quite a few initiatives. So hopefully we make some progress. And if those more general adaptation measurement frameworks advance, that might help us for the tourism sector as well, then to apply them.
Yeah, because it is, this kind of, on all approaches and research that is looking at climate adaptation, it seems that it's been long talked about, the kind of lack of monitoring and evaluation methods and the lack of measuring and how do you do that. So there's been probably in the past 5-6 years, there's been more and more thinking. Yeah. But there hasn't, I think the different development banks and, the kind of, I would say, normal donor organizations, they have their processes in place. And so the GIZ, the German one has been quite, putting more effort and thinking, in that space.
So there's a great research project to look at all those even donor evaluation frameworks now and identify indicators. Yeah. Because you're right. The carbon emissions from the Paris Agreement, I'm saying lightly now, you can measure them easily. It's obviously not true. And there's a lot of, it's not so easy, but relative to the adaptation side. Yeah. So I'd be very interested if there's more progress on that side and we can feed that back into tourism.
No, it is. And and that's why I think the dashboard is a very good example of, how do you take big data sets and actually start making sense and provide some evidence of the particular trends. Because I think still with adaptation, so even in the fourth assessment report, there was a call in 2007, there was a, call for more case studies on adaptation. Yeah. And now we have lots and lots of case studies on adaptation, but the kind of critique still that we have is that, how we're going to make sense of what the trends are rather than just what a single, that's obviously IPCC, tries to kind of, summarize the literature and look at those trends. But
it is interesting. And some sectors have moved ahead anyway. If I think of, and you could measure adaptation, but then the question is it sustainable? Because I'm thinking of snowmaking and ski fields, where the ski fields might well quantify and measure. And frankly, most ski fields around the world can put a dollar value literally on their snowmaking investment. It's massive. It's probably one of the largest cost factors, I would say. So you could actually measure that. But the question is, so what, that measure doesn't tell us sustainability. So it tells us that they are maybe more resilient to climate variability and maybe longer term change for a particular location. And you've got a dollar value. So you have to think it for. Yeah. But that would be a very tourism specific adaptation in a subsector that you could actually measure. And you might measure investment in desalination plants, which is actually happening also in island states a lot in tourism. Yeah. And again, you then say, well, they have adapted. This is why this is where we started. This is why adaptation and mitigation together are so important. Because I've been doing work in the Maldives. They all have their desalination plant. And it's all based on diesel. Which they ship to that island, which is shipped to Male, to the fuel plant. Yeah. So, yes, adapted, but not very sustainably. So you've got to measure them together. Yeah. And I think, last week I just saw where lots of research institutions, but countries as well at this high-level meeting. So that's exactly what they were saying is, that's why the Paris Agreement, that UNF CCC processes have to be brought together with the SDGs. Exactly right. So that there is sustainability and it's not, you can make mitigation or adaptation, decisions in the short term, but they might, increase inequality or. And obviously, exactly, and it's about the outcome that you want, and that's exactly what needs to happen from a business point of view, and this is what much of tourism is. Of course, the business makes the best decision for the business, and in that case, it would be to build a desalination plant. So the business case is not necessarily the sustainable outcome in the long term. So that's a major challenge. Yeah. So lots to do. Lots to do on the conceptual line to find those frameworks, but also probably more data required, and then the communication side. Yes. Okay.
All right. Well, thanks so much. That's been very informative.
Okay. Thank you.
And hopefully in the next episode, we'll be talking more about disasters. Thank you, Susanne.
Thank you.
Okay, adapters, that is a wrap for the Australia Adapt segment. And so for the final part of this podcast, I have my final dispatches from the National Adaptation Forum. And that's where I went around and did some micro podcasts. And so these are some of the voices from when I was at the forum that I wanted to include that weren't with the original piece that I had last week, just so you're not too confused. All right. Thanks. Hey, adapters. We are back at the National Adaptation Forum. You keep hearing me say that, but I don't know any other way to intro this thing. I am with Amanda Sessa right now. Hey, Amanda.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going great. So what do you think of the forum so far?
So far, it's pretty spectacular. It's busy. There's a lot of sessions going on all at once. It seems like every time I find a couple sessions I want to go to, they happen concurrently, and I'm having to choose. But it's great to see a lot of old friends and make new ones.
So tell me about the sessions. Which ones stood out?
You know, the one this morning is probably my favorite session so far. It was on first foods and food security. So it was a panel of tribal adaptation professionals and researchers who work with tribes and First Nations talking about what's happening with first foods, whether it's traditional hunters and gatherers or farming societies, and how climate is impacting the patterns or the timing or the quality of foods that are available. And it was pretty fascinating to hear it from the people who it most affects.
Okay, so where are you coming from? You're kind of in transition right now. What were you doing before?
So for the last 6 years, I have been working for the Northwest Boreal Landscape Conservation Cooperative, or LCCs. Those are public-private partnerships that span North America and get people working across boundaries, across agencies and organizations, out of their silos, and to partner together and try to tackle big issues like climate change that one organization can't do alone.
Okay, so you are no longer a Fed, though, right?
That's right. Not even 2 weeks.
So you can say anything you want.
This new freedom is pretty exciting.
Well, I've heard some bad rumblings about the LCCs and the Climate Science Centers. Any sort of insight on that?
I think it's rumors at this point. Yeah, we still don't have a deputy secretary and or a director for the Fish and Wildlife Service, for instance, and so there's nothing moving, and so rumblings are just rumblings at this point. I'm pretty optimistic, actually.
That sounded like a Fed answer, sugarcoating an obviously dark cloud that's coming. Let it go. You are not a Fed I know it's just natural to just spin it positively.
No, I'm serious. I really think that even in the new administration, working together, finding ways to be more efficient and, looking holistically at the landscape, not just looking at a single species or a single conservation issue, but looking at a working landscape that's providing multiple values for people who are in the extractive industries or people who are in the conservation world or people who live off the land in a subsistence lifestyle, trying to get everybody to work together for a sustainable landscape. I think that's not at odds at all with the new administration.
Then it's a shame they're losing you because you have very positive energy about it all, so that's a shame. All right, so I'm going to do a major pivot here. Something I think very interesting is that you, now that you're leaving the federal government, you are starting your own podcast on adaptation.
Yeah, I'm giving it a whirl. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I thought that this conference would be a good time to meet people, get some practice talking with people with sticking a microphone in their faces, hone my interview skills, that kind of thing, and also meet folks like you who've been doing it a while and have a lot to offer. And I really appreciate your help so far and all the insights.
So I heard the name of the first episode is America Adapt Sucks. Is there any truth to that comment?
No comment.
So when can people expect some of these episodes to be out?
I'm thinking early fall of 2017.
All right. Well, give me a little bit more background. What kind of stories do you want to tell? I mean, I have stories that I want to tell, and I think the sky's the limit. There's a need for a lot more people telling these stories. And so what would you hope to accomplish through the podcast?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because it's ever evolving. When I was a Fed and I'm thinking, okay, what's a fun, creative project that I can do that's completely different than the kind of federal bureaucracy stuff that I do on day to day. So it was the creative side that drew me to wanting to make a go of this. And then now that I'm here and I'm starting to get some interviews, it's allowing me to get clear on what I want and what I don't want. And coming to a conference, it reminds me of how bad of communicators we are in the scientific field. And that's not to put anybody down, just the collective we as a whole. We're pretty bad at it. And I think that is directly correlated to public sentiment about science and allows for, fake news and alternative facts to be accepted because we're not getting our messages out there. It's not that we're not communicating our messages, but we're not communicating them in a way that's being heard by people. So this week here at the forum, I'm starting to think about how we can tell stories and tell them in a way that is relevant to people, that grips them emotionally, that makes, people that are being impacted by climate change seem like very real people. And people who are studying climate change also seem like real people. And underneath all of the jargon and the scientific expertise and the acronyms and the initials and everything, there's a lot of passion there. And how can we use storytelling to get to the bottom of that passion and use that to reach audiences or listeners in a new way?
That was a great way to describe why you're justifying doing, and I think very inspirational. And I hope you follow through on this. I hope you're producing these things and you have the regular podcast, because I think there'd be a real demand. I think I look back on why did I decide to do it? And I was probably thinking, I want to hear my own voice on a regular basis. What could I possibly do? What's this podcasting thing all about? You had a much more inspirational one, so I appreciate that.
I also hate hearing my own voice, so I'm going to have to get over that.
No, seriously, some advice is don't speechify. I constantly get feedback saying, Doug, shut your mouth, get to the guest.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and I think that there are so many interesting people that, I think that you and I and the interviewers seek can just sit back and let people run with it.
All right. Thanks so much, Amanda. And I'm sure we will be in touch.
Sounds great. Thanks, Doug.
Hey, Adapters. We are back on day 2 of the National Adaptation Forum. And I am with America Adapts listener, Natalie Ambrosio. Hey, Natalie. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks. How are you?
I'm great. So where are you coming from and why are you here?
I come from the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative, or NDGAIN, and I'm here to build connections for NDGAIN and reach out to our various advisors and collaborators, but also just meet a lot of people and learn a ton at the forum.
So a couple things. So why would anyone be interested in NDGAIN?
So NDGAIN, our work, we have a country index that examines countries' vulnerability to climate change hazards and their readiness to adapt. But we're also working on building our urban adaptation assessment, and we are examining the climate hazard specific vulnerability in every U.S. city over 100,000 in population, as well as their readiness to adapt. And so we're hoping that will be very interesting and great conversation starters for government leaders and also community members in the cities.
Okay, so have you had a favorite presentation so far in these last day and a half?
Ooh, that's hard to narrow it down.
Is that just an answer that you've been multitasking and not listening to these presentations?
No, absolutely not. I really enjoyed I can't remember specifically what it was called, tracking equitable adaptation. I think it was mostly people based in California, and that was a really interesting forum to hear what people are doing and then also push back from certain community members and examining what it really means to be working equitably. That's something with NDGAIN that we have an equity lens over all of our vulnerability assessments, so making sure that adaptation efforts are distributed equitably, I think, is a very important question and challenge to always keep in mind.
So you're a relatively young professional. What does it mean for you to be in the field of adaptation? What are you thinking about when you're because it's a new emerging issue, and so you're jumping right into it, which is kind of unique for a lot of us.
As I emerge in the professional world, and so does this adaptation field, I think it's really important to just spread awareness, start at that level, and first off, spreading awareness so everybody should know what climate change adaptation is, and that's not how it is right now. And so I think about outreach and how my work with NDGAIN or how I'm listening to things at the forum, how that is really going to be applicable to my parents who aren't educated in this at all, or the people walking around downtown, how you can really connect it and reach out to the people who we are doing all this to impact.
So are you based in South Bend?
Yeah, right now the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative is based at South Bend, Indiana.
So you revealed to me that you're moving from South Bend to California, which seems like a very smart move.
Yes, I'm originally from the Bay Area of California, and so I'm very excited to move back there. I'll still be doing work with Indie Gain. We have a few dozen cities in California in our assessment, and so I will be excited at the opportunities to collaborate in a more in-person way while I'm in California.
The reputation of Notre Dame, and yet you get to live in California. Lucky.
Pretty ideal. I'm very lucky.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doug.
Hey, Adapters, we're back, and I am with Pam here at the National Adaptation Forum. Hey, Pam, how are you?
I'm doing fine today. How are you doing?
I am doing just delightful. So why are you here at the National Adaptation Forum?
A couple of different reasons. I originally joined because with a colleague I was helping to coordinate a workshop at the beginning of the forum looking at how to use essentially role-playing in video games as a way to kind of defuse tension and conflict situations. So that was the first reason. But then, beyond that, this is a space that I am working in professionally, and having the opportunity to hear about what other folks are doing in other sectors across the country is a great way to, get ideas about how I can do my own work better.
So there was this Game of Thrones thing. Is that you, or is that something else?
Game of Thrones is not me. I mean, what's your question exactly?
Well, I was just curious. It's related because I don't think that session's happened yet, but someone had mentioned that to me before, and I'll probably go sit in on it. I want to learn more about it.
Yeah, okay, no, that particular session, I didn't realize there was a session with that in the title. No, that is not me. There was a workshop before the conference on Monday. The idea there is that when you have different stakeholders around the table, traditional ways of working through problems kind of focus on the problem itself. But if you sort of get stakeholders working through a scenario together, then instead of fighting each other, they're working together towards a common goal. So that was that's what that was all about, not Game of Thrones.
Okay, so what presentations are you hoping to see over the next day and a half?
There you've got me. I plan out my sessions as I go, depending on who I talk to and what sort of conversations I end up getting into. So I haven't looked yet.
That's okay. I'm spending most of my time in the hallways anyway. This networking is much more productive, I find, although there are some good presentations out there.
No, I definitely have attended several really fantastic presentations over the course of the day, in addition to the various networking conversations I've had. So if you want an example of one I've been to this morning that was super useful, planners from the southeastern coast of Florida were presenting work that they had done on helping the very large urban areas, very developed and dense urban areas down there deal with groundwater rise and sea level rise and increased flooding from storms and rainfall. Just this, perfect storm of water coming from all directions in an area that's incredibly densely developed. And, what infrastructure solutions are they implementing to try to deal with all of this so that, people still have a decent quality of life and, there's not a huge amount of property damage as conditions change. So that was an example of a session this morning that I found fascinating.
So this is a relatively new forum. This is its third one. Are you happy with it? Will you come to the next one?
Yeah, I'd have to say I'm quite impressed. This is the first time I've been to this forum. I've been to a couple of other fora over the course of the past year and a half professionally, and so I've had the chance to sort of compare how they're organized, who attends, what their goals are, what sorts of stories are shared, and what kind of networking and collaboration happens. And of the several different ones that I've been to, this one has impressed me more than most for a couple of reasons. First, because the government, private, and academic sectors and NGOs seem to be pretty equally represented here, which I haven't seen at other places. Also, it's very mission focused. I mean, some different fora have different, scopes of things they try to address. Some address all issues in conservation biology. Others address, very targeted and focused things. This takes the concept of climate adaptation, and I think the level of focus is right, the size is right, and the diversity of sectors is right.
Last question, and you have one word to answer. Just one. I don't want any waffling on this. If you had to describe to my listeners that are not here St. Paul in one word, what would you say?
Charming.
Oh, very sweet answer. Okay, thank you so much, Pam.
Thank you, Doug.
That is a wrap, Adapters. Thanks to Johanna and Susanne for that awesome segment of Australia Adapts. Great to see the tourism sector start to think about what climate change will mean for that industry. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or however you get your podcast. I know people consume them different ways. And if you're a regular listener and you're looking to spread the word of America Adapts, then spread it. Share the iTunes links. They're in the show notes. And do this with 5 of your friends, family, or colleagues. podcasts grow by word of mouth. And don't forget to join the Facebook page and community group. Search for America Adapts. And I've had quite a few people join in the past week. I love seeing that uptick in traffic, and I'd love to see the community grow. I share articles there. I provide commentary. People who join the group share articles, and sometimes we get these really interesting conversations going. So yeah, if you're out there, you're on your phone, you're looking at it, just search in Facebook for America Adapts and join the group. Okay, next week I have Dr. Ben Preston from RAND Corporation on, and I'm pretty sure, 90% sure, I've got a huge announcement to make next week. It's a very big deal for America Adapts, and no, it's not related to some high-profile guest. We'll do those in the future, but this is a very big announcement for America Adapts, and I'm hoping to announce it next week. And don't forget to write a review on iTunes. Sometimes it's a little trickier than it needs to be, but please, it's very helpful when people search for podcasts. It shows up because of the rankings. And finally, I'd like to thank you, my listeners. You are the best podcast listeners out there, and don't let anyone else tell you differently. Okay, let's wrap this up. Don't forget, when you adapt, we adapt. America Adapts. All right, everyone, have a great week.